What a joy it is to be in worship with you this morning. Before we read the third lesson, I'd like to give you a little background. The Gospel of Mark, most scholars agree, is the earliest gospel of the four that we have in what is called the Second Testament. In fact, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke greatly depend upon Mark's version of the events of Jesus' life and ministry, so much so that not only do they overlap, in many places they actually appear word for word in the English or in the original languages. We miss much of this in English. The Gospel of Mark also moves through the story of Jesus quickly. As Reverend Carol McDonald once said from this pulpit, the author's favorite word is immediately. For this author, there is no time to waste with extraneous details or interpretive work. It's as if they want to get to the heart of it all right from the start. There's no birth narrative, no nativity, no angelic visitors to Mary and Joseph, no shepherds, no kings. No, this gospel begins the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And from there, away we go with John the Baptist crying out in the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord, then a baptism, then a voice from heaven announcing, "You are my Son, the beloved, in you I am well pleased." After 40 days in the wilderness, Jesus returns to Galilee. His public ministry begins there and in that city, which would become kind of a home base for him of sorts, with the calling of his first disciples. And all of that happens in just the first 20 verses of the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark. This is Mark's Gospel. It doesn't slow down until it ends. And as abruptly as it begins, it ends even more so. When you look at the text of Mark in an English Bible, you will notice something when you reach the end. There are actually 3 endings to the Gospel of Mark. The first ends with verse 8. Then there is what is called a shorter ending. And then there is one that is called the longer ending. Yeah, creative, right? Scholars agree that what we call verse 8 is actually the original ending of the gospel. It fits with the author's style. The other 2 endings were added sometime later, likely by scribes, to perhaps add a little interpretation to what might have been seen as an unsatisfactory ending to the story. So they put things in that they wanted other people to know. But remember, Mark was written closest to the time of the events that the author was recording. And so by the time that the additions to this text were made, more had actually been added to the story of Jesus. So let's begin together this morning at the end of chapter 15 first and see what the author of the Gospel of Mark wanted us to see, to feel, how the story ended for them, or perhaps how it began for the readers and for the hearers. So this is the third lesson this morning, and it comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, beginning with verse 46, and then through chapter 16, verse 8. Let us together listen for the voice of the Lord. Then Joseph of Arimathea brought a linen cloth, and taking Jesus' body down from the cross, wrapped it in the linen cloth and laid it in the tomb that had been hewn out of a rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid. Chapter 16. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They'd been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He's not here. Look, there is the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror, trembling, and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We stood there together on the top of a hill overlooking a valley, admiring the pastoral scene. The beautiful greens of the trees leading down to a babbling stream surrounded by lush farmland. And there was a small farmhouse in the distance with cows grazing in the field. Suddenly, as was prone to happen in this region, a storm began to build in the distance. We could see the clouds beginning to form and billow and darken. It was the kind of storm where you could literally see the line of rain coming. It quickly became clear that the storm was going to move across the valley, so we decided to stay put and watch its progress. It was an amazing sight. To see this sun-drenched land slowly give way, inch by inch, to the complex grays of the rainstorm. And it was a real gully washer, as my grandfather would say. My friend and I stood there quiet for, maybe 20 minutes. And it was really a magnificent thing to behold, but we were not prepared for what happened next. Have you ever been at the epicenter of lightning? Yeah. Directly above our heads was the brightest flash of cloud-to-cloud lightning and the instantaneous loudest clap of thunder that I had ever heard, and I've never experienced since. The earth literally shook, and we could feel the percussion reverberating in our chests. When we recovered from our shock and our fear, we finally made eye contact with one another, and we were both in tears and trembling. We began to laugh, partially because we were afraid, but also because we were in awe of what we had just witnessed. Now, we got out of there pretty quickly after that. No one needs to be that close when lightning begins to flash. But the strangest thing happened. As we left the site, neither one of us said anything to the other for the entire journey. There just weren't words adequate enough to express what we were feeling or to describe what we had just witnessed. We left in silence. And when we finally rejoined the rest of our group, we didn't tell anyone for the longest time. What were we supposed to say? How do you explain all of that to someone else? We needed time to process all that happened. You ever had an experience like that? Something that left you without words, maybe even without breath? The kind of experience that left you wondering silently, what just happened? You likely have. Now just imagine if you had been present during the unfurling of the story from our text this morning. Try not to overburden it with everything else you know about the story. Allow it to be what it is. Enter into it. Jesus had died. Joseph of Arimathea placed Jesus' body in a tomb. The women, the ones who were at the cross when Jesus died, the ones that didn't leave him, and the ones who went with Joseph of Arimathea to the tomb and saw where they laid Jesus and witnessed the stone being rolled into place to seal in the lingering effects of death. These women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, they went back to the tomb on the first day of the week when the sun had risen. And as they worried about how they would roll away the stone, they lifted their gaze and they saw that the stone had already been rolled away from the entrance of the tomb. And when they finally peered into the tomb, they saw a young man. Now, we aren't told who this young man is, but clearly he had a message to deliver. Something that changed everything. We are told what he said. Do not be afraid. Yeah, right. They must have thought. Do not be afraid. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He's not here. Now go. Go on. Tell the disciples that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. And there you will see him just as he told you. And then they went away from the tomb. Trembling and amazement overwhelmed them. Of course it did. How could it not? And we are told that they fled in silence. They said nothing to anyone. They were afraid. But really, what were they supposed to say? Jesus, their friend, their rabbi, the one on whom and in whom they had placed their hopes, the one who died, was no longer where they expected him to be. He'd been raised. And what did that mean? What could it mean? They knew better than any of us that this changed everything. Not only would their lives now be different, they would somehow be different. What could they say that could adequately express what they had just witnessed? Perhaps silent awe was the most appropriate response. Any words would only be extraneous. There just weren't enough words. The right words. Any words. At least not right away. As Dr. Gail O'Day once wrote, one does not need to illustrate or elaborate on the triumph of Easter. Eventually, they had to say something to someone. I mean, we are all here today as a result of what these brave, faithful women saw, what they experienced, and their courageous testimony to all of it. Our Easter celebrations and all of those all around the world hinge on their testimony. And when they finally told Jesus' disciples and Peter what happened, they also shared the message the young man in white told them to share. Go on. Go on to Galilee, go home. Jesus is going there ahead of you, and you'll see him there, just as he told you. And then, friends, that's it. That's the whole story, according to the author of the Gospel of Mark. They went home. Now, I'm curious. When they returned to Galilee, as they'd been told to do, as they returned to their home where everything and everyone was familiar, the streets and the buildings, the lake and the boats, the places and the faces they knew and recognized, the family members, the friends, the real or at least perceived enemies. When they went home, did they see Jesus? And if they did, where was he? And what did the risen one look like? Did they begin to see him everywhere? Like there in the faces of their neighbors, there in the familiar words spoken in the synagogue, there in the lives of their enemies, real or perceived, there in the outcast, the forgotten, the marginalized, the cast aside, there in the poor and in the rich, and those who had more than enough to share, and in those who didn't have anything to call their own, there in the alleyways, streets, byways, there in the ordinary work of their hands, there in themselves. And somehow, that would change everything. For if the risen Christ was witnessed everywhere, no one could ever be left out again. No one could be marginalized. No unjust system would ever be allowed to go unchecked. Death-dealing ways would cease. All things, everything would become new. So then, what about us? What happens when we hear the words of the young man from our text? Jesus has been raised. He's not here. He's gone ahead of you. You'll see him, just as he told you. Do we have the courage to get up and go home to everything that is familiar, knowing that Jesus is going ahead of us? We don't have to say anything to anyone. There really aren't words to express what we have witnessed, but if we lift up our gaze, we'll see the resurrected one in the faces of everyone we meet. And the repercussions of that lightning bolt will reverberate in the core of our beings. We may even tremble at the thought, for it changes everything. It changes us. Nothing can ever be the same. So go on. Go home. Lift up your eyes. The stone is already rolled away. The resurrected Jesus is going ahead of you. You'll see him there, all around you. Behold, the face of the Christ, the risen one. This changes everything. And friends, it's just the beginning. To God be the glory. Hallelujah. Amen.